Now, I've been setting the stage for the American Revolution by spending a lot of time talking about the French and Indian War. And it's important that I do this because, as you'll recall, the French and Indian War left Britain severely indebted. It had considerable debt that it had raised in order to win that war. Now it was time to pay off the debt. And the people in London, Parliament, the people in charge of making laws for Britain, decided that the best way to pay off the debt was to start putting taxes on the American colonies. After all, they had fought the war on behalf of the American colonies. Shouldn't the American colonies pay some of that debt? In order to accomplish this, Parliament created a series of unpopular laws which created ripple effects in the American colonies. The first law came about in 1764. It was called the Currency Act, and what it did was forbid colonies from issuing paper money. Now, this was actually a major problem in the New World. At that time, there was a lot of different kinds of money, and not all of it was good. The best kind of money was called specie, which meant it was actual silver or gold coins. Gold coins were very rare, but silver coins were quite popular. They were mostly printed by the Spanish, and they were often called pieces of 8. Those were actual coins, specie, that could be used to pay any debt. There were also pound notes, pieces of paper that claimed to be worth certain amounts of British pounds. Those usually were pretty valuable too. But also in North America, every colony printed its own money as well. So there were Pennsylvania pounds, there were Virginia pounds, and none of these were equal to a British pound, and they weren't even close to being as valuable as specie. So the problem was, if a merchant in Pennsylvania had a debt and needed to pay a British person, he might pay in Pennsylvania pounds. Meanwhile, the British merchant knew those aren't worth very much. When Parliament decided to pass the Currency Act, it basically was forbidding any further continental currency. And the result was it was very hard to pay debts. A year later, in 1765, Parliament passed the Second Act, which caused a problem. It was called the Quartering Act, and it basically said that colonists had to provide room and board for any British troops. Now, there was a certain cultural thing about being British. The British had always lived on an island, and according to them, they didn't need to have troops. What they needed was a good navy, someone to protect the seas, but they didn't need a standing army. In fact, a standing army was dangerous because a standing army could cause mayhem, and it could also throw off the balance of power. So in Britain, it was very rare to have a standing army. But now, after the French and Indian War, there had been an enormous army raised by the British to win that war. Where were they going to go? They couldn't go back to Britain because Britain didn't want a standing army. So instead, they left them in the colonies. But then it became expensive to house them and to feed them. And so there was a Quartering Act, which would cause the colonists to have to house and feed them. That was very unpopular too. Not only did it cost money, but it made the colonists think, why do we have a standing army? You don't have one back in Britain. Why do we have one here? There was a third act that also caused a problem, and this was a big problem. It was called the Stamp Act, also in 1765. The Stamp Act was an attempt by Parliament to actually raise money. The law was this: any official document had to be printed on official parliamentary paper. You could tell parliamentary paper because it would have a small embossed seal on the paper, a stamp that made it legitimate. So, for example, legal documents like wills, and also even things like magazines and playing cards and newspapers, all had to have the stamp. Of course, the stamp was only available in certain places, in the port towns of like Boston and Philadelphia, and it could only be bought with pound sterling. Not Philadelphia notes, not Virginia notes, only pound sterling, or specie. Now that money that the Stamp Act was supposed to make was going to be used to pay the standing army, the wages of the soldiers. This, of course, created a huge uproar. And in fact, you might have heard the phrase, no taxation without representation. This was the first time that Parliament had tried to directly tax the American colonies, and they reacted angrily. They said, how can you put a tax on us when we don't get to represent ourselves in Parliament? Parliament in Britain was made up of two houses. There was the upper house called the House of Lords, and that position was appointed. Certain people in Britain who were very wealthy and powerful or who had a certain estate could work in the House of Lords. But there was also a lower house called the House of Commons, and that one was elected. The House of Commons often made most of the laws and included the right to tax and hold the money strings of the British Empire. But there were no representatives from the 13 colonies in Parliament. On the other hand, the colonies each had their own assembly. They had their own version of Parliament. Some of them called it the House of Burgesses, some called it a Congress, but they all had their own representative assembly. So in Virginia, there was a representative assembly. In Pennsylvania, there was a representative assembly. And each of these assemblies was responsible for raising taxes for that colony. So the colonists thought to themselves, we already pay taxes, and we pay it to a group who represent us. Why should we pay taxes to Parliament who doesn't represent us? They began to group together and to form all kinds of small groups that would riot and also tear down certain official British buildings in order to try and say that they were against the Stamp Act. In fact, there was a group that was created called the Sons of Liberty, which was mostly made up of commoners, and they were directly formed to try and intimidate tax collectors who were trying to collect the Stamp Act. Parliament responded to this crisis by recognizing that the Americans had begun to cause all kinds of problems. So they rescinded the Stamp Act in 1766, but on that same day passed a new act. It was called the Declaratory Act, and it declared that Parliament always has the right to pass any law whatsoever that's binding on the colonies. That was their way of trying to back away from the Stamp Act crisis, but actually the damage had already been done. The colonists had done a couple things. First off, they had created the Sons of Liberty, these groups of colonists. Some of them were in Virginia, some of them were in South Carolina, some of them were in Philadelphia, but they were all beginning to communicate to one another. They would sometimes leave messages in the newspapers for other Sons of Liberty groups. Sometimes they would write letters to people that they knew in other colonies. And in this way, even the common people were beginning to unite just a little bit behind this idea of liberty. Additionally, the colonists had called together a small Congress in response to the Stamp Act. And that small Congress had met in New York. The Congress had invited all 18 colonies from the British seaboard, from all the way up to Canada, all the way down to the Caribbean. But only 9 colonies came. They were all from the American states. Those 9 colonies decided to get together and do a boycott. A boycott is when you decide to not buy something in a way of punishing somebody else. So what the colonists were doing was saying, we're not going to buy cloth and we're not going to buy tea. And in that way, we'll show Britain that they can't put a Stamp Act on us. The boycott actually worked. British merchants noticed the loss of revenue, and they actually complained to Parliament. They said, you've got to get rid of this Stamp Act. It's costing us money. And Parliament finally gave in. So the Americans had learned 2 things. We can communicate with each other. Our commoners can get together as Sons of Liberty and get something done. And also, we can use our pocketbooks to make changes. A year later, in 1767, Parliament passed another act called the Townshend Act. And it was actually a series of different laws, some of which were more aggravating than others. But the most difficult one, the one that caused the most trouble, was a tax on certain items that were not made in the colonies: paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. These were all imports that could not be made in the colonies, and when they were imported, they were taxed. The colonists once again began crying out about taxation and representation. There was also another part that was really important, and that is that the tax on tea actually made tea profitability very low. Now, tea was at that time the most important drink in the American colonies. Everybody liked to drink tea, and especially women would get together and talk and drink tea and sew and do the things that they were supposed to be doing, caring for their households and such. So when this tax came on the tea, it suddenly made the tea industry unbalanced. It used to be that the best tea was brought from India, and it would first go to London, and then from London it would go to the colonies. And there were all these merchants that were buying tea in London and bringing it over to the colonies. And it cost a certain amount of money to do this. The tea was at a certain rate. But whenever Parliament changed the tea tax, it made it so that merchants couldn't buy tea in London, and instead the British East India Tea Company could sell it directly in the colonies. The result of that is tea prices went way down. Now that sounds good if you're a consumer of tea. But what if you're a seller of tea? What if all of a sudden the most common drink in all the colonies becomes so cheap that you can't make money on it? Everybody wants it, but if you sell it, you don't make enough money to even pay for your ships and your crew. All of a sudden, no one was making money. The people who used to smuggle in tea, they weren't making money because the illegal stuff was so cheap. And the people who were trying to legally sell tea, they weren't making money because it was so cheap. No one was happy. So the Americans decided that they needed to boycott tea. Now we need to pay attention to that, because tea ends up being a major problem in the years that were about to come around. They do another boycott, and it actually works again. British imports dropped by 38% for the next 2 years. My main point in telling you this story about tea and different acts of Parliament is to show you that Britain was bankrupt. It was deeply in debt because of the French and Indian War. And the only way it was going to recover that debt was to pass some laws that taxed the North American colonies. But when they did, those North American colonies reacted negatively. And that is one of the reasons for the American Revolution.